Let's talk about some companies that have taken advantage of the new environment and have developed some successful strategies. Therapeutic area, taking advantage of regulatory changes and basically having the right drug at the right time with the right technology. Let's first talk about pain. There have been more successful drug delivery companies based on controlled release delivery of pain drugs than probably any other therapeutic area. I don't know if you remember the old Alza Corporation, one of the leaders in drug delivery. They developed Duragesic, a transdermal fentanyl patch. It generated almost $1.5 billion in sales annually. Anesta, Salt Lake City-based company, developed another fentanyl product for breakthrough cancer pain called Actic, did over $500 million. Similarly, Fentora. Over the last decade, though, some of these companies developing pain drugs struggled. Opana was a drug that really didn't do well. Caldolor, an intravenous hospital pain product, didn't do well. But recently, we've seen some successful launches. Flector patch, Affirmative IV acetaminophen, and a local company, Pacira, which has launched a drug called Casparil, which is doing very, very well in its first year. Let's take a look at one of the companies, Cadence. There's very significant market demand for a hospital-based product that spares opioids. Companies tried to develop an intravenous acetaminophen product for decades. Finally, a Swiss drug delivery company developed a successful one, licensed it to Bristol Myers. Within 5 years, it became a $250 million product. Small company called Cadence got the rights in the US when Bristol Myers restructured. This product called Affirmative was launched in 2011. It had a very slow start, but now it looks like it's going to generate $100 million, broad formulary acceptance. This could be a $500 million product in the next 7 to 8 years. All right, let's talk about companies that took advantage of the regulatory climate. Desi drugs, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're actually products that are so old that they were out there before the FDA actually formally approved pharmaceuticals. So these are drugs that have been around for 40, 50, 60 years. Adams Respiratory, in the cough cold area, as you can see, developed a new drug, sold itself for almost $4 billion. And Urand took advantage of the regulatory environment, developed a new drug for cystic fibrosis, also successful. Let's take a look at Adams. You've probably seen Mr. Mucus on TV. Guaifenesin has probably been around for 100 years. There are hundreds of products on the market, but the FDA said, if you do a clinical trial, we will remove all competitive products. So Adams developed a controlled release version of guaifenesin. Upon approval, all other products were removed, effectively giving it a monopoly. And it became a $400 million drug 4 years after launch. Now, this was an over-the-counter product, so it did almost $500 million. 2.5 years after its IPO, Adams was up 250%. It was sold for $2.5 billion to Reckitt, a European consumer company. Venture investors made a lot of money. To get a 15 times return, that's like hitting 3 home runs in the same baseball game. And the public investors also made a lot of money. $25 million was put into this clinical trial. The company was sold for $4 billion. Very ingenious idea, taking advantage of the regulatory climate. There's still also room for controlled release products. Effectively, the right product at the right time, at the right place. So Solidyne. This is a product developed by Medicis, which was recently bought by Valeant. Medicis was probably the leading independent dermatology company in the United States. What's Solidyne? It's controlled release minocycline. How long has minocycline been along? Decades. But all the products are twice a day. This became the best launch ever in the history of the dermatology industry. It reached $400 million in a year. It was basically an acne drug for rich kids, but did $400 million. Niaspan. This is a vitamin, niacin. Niacin causes flushing. The people at Coast developed a controlled release version. Let's take a look. So as you know, niacin raises HDL. The product was launched in 1997. 10 years later, sales exceeded $600 million. Abbott was very interested in getting into the cholesterol market. This was a unique product. So 10 years after launch, this company with basically a controlled release vitamin was sold for almost $4 billion. Very clever product, and clearly there was a place in the market for it. The founder, Michael J. Harris, as I told you, some of these founders can raise enough money and not dilute themselves. He had over a 50% share in the company and personally made over $2 billion. Okay, so we've talked about various success stories in drug delivery, taking advantage of the regulatory environment, coming up with the right controlled release product, working in an area where there's been some successful, therapeutic areas where there's some successful results. So let's now let's look into a crystal ball. This is just my view. Everyone will have their own view. Here are some new products to watch. David Pyatt, the CEO of Allergan, if you attended his presentation this morning, he talked about Levodex. Ergotamine's been around for decades. It's used as a rescue medication for severe migraine. It's got some serious side effects. A company called MAP in San Francisco developed a new aerosol version, basically using the lungs as a portal into the body. The product is supposed to be approved in a couple months. Peak sales, as David said, are about half a billion. This company actually was bought a couple weeks ago by Allergan for $1 billion in cash, interestingly, before the PDUFA date. That's pretty risky. Allergan must know what they're doing, but clearly, and it's one of the smartest companies in pharmaceutical, so clearly there's some value here. Nectar also has an interesting product in the opioid-induced constipation market, naloxone. Phase 3 results were good. We're waiting for the open-label safety database to be unlocked and presented. AstraZeneca, if this gets approved, is going to pay Nectar, I believe, $700 million. And it's not a 2 or 3% royalty like in the old days. This is a 15, 16, 17% royalty. So a high value added product, at least to AstraZeneca, who needs products desperately. Now we have a new entrant, Teva, biggest generic company in the world. Copaxone, as you may know, has become the most successful drug in multiple sclerosis. It's a $4 billion drug injected once a day. Now, the patent expires on Copaxone in a couple years. It's 50% of Teva's profit, hugely profitable. So Teva needs to keep part of this business. What are they doing? They're developing a 3 times a week Copaxone, and that product should be on the market next year. This will be an interesting acid test. Most of these reformulations are with pills. This is with an injection. Teva believes they can capture 30 to 40% of the market. If so, they'll keep almost $2 billion in revenues as the original patent rolls off. And finally, at the Analyst Day they had last month, Teva is getting into drug delivery. They call them new therapeutic entities. If anyone here is from Teva, I'd like an explanation, because Teva says they're going to be able to launch 30 of these a year. Now, I followed the drug delivery industry for a long time, and developing 1 a year is pretty good. So if any of you companies in drug delivery may want to approach Teva, because I don't know how they're going to do 30 on their own, and probably they'll need some technologies like yours. But this is a huge focus at Teva, a company with $20 billion in sales. Now let's look at 2013, the year ahead. As I said before, things are very optimistic, much better. It's a much better environment than we've had in many, many years. According to the Deutsche Bank economists, and by the way, I used to be an economist, and I know that they're almost always wrong, like the weathermen, but anyways, our economist says that the economy is posed to rebound. There'll be less macro shocks to the system. Unemployment will gradually go down, and multiples will increase for most stocks. So it seems to be a good environment for the equity markets. As I said before, more IPOs. That's a very encouraging sign for investments in pharma. The patent cliffs are largely over. Investors are interested in large cap pharmaceuticals again. Many of them, like Pfizer, have doubled or close to doubled in the last 3 or 4 years. And there'll be a lot more acquisitions. So the framework looks good for 2013. Now let's take a look at the sector. In previous years, so I have 5 pluses and 3 minuses. 2 years ago when I was here, I probably had 6 minuses and 2 pluses. Now there are other factors to consider, but let's go through these. So managed care, relentless pressure, that's not going to change anytime soon, particularly in large therapeutic areas. The economy is still not great. during the significant downturn, people stopped taking their pills, they split their pills, they couldn't afford their medication. So with an economy that's still weak, this is an issue. And of course, the FDA has clamped down on manufacturing. How many companies do you know that have been completely sidelined by the FDA? There are a lot of drug shortages out there. But the good news is there's good pricing, improved pricing, higher revenues, higher earnings, better cash flow. 4 or 5 years ago, 9 out of 10 new drug launches really didn't do that well. We're now starting to see better and better launches, perhaps more value-added products. Again, 2011, 2012, each year $12 billion worth of branded drugs went generic. Going forward, it may only be $3 or $4 billion. So companies, the revenues will start ramping. There's a big drop in the number of drugs going off patent, so that's a good sign. And the good news for all of you is capital is readily available, whether it's venture financing, mezzanine financing, IPO financing, debt financing, convertible bond financing. The markets are wide open, and investors are willing to take on more risk. And finally, through the last 5 years, most investors in healthcare were dedicated investors. So the Fidelity Healthcare Fund, the T. Rowe Price Healthcare Fund. But most generalist investors, most growth investors, most global investors really had a small position in healthcare stocks and pharma stocks. That is now starting to broaden. The best indicator, I indicated the Zoetis IPO. It was 20 times oversubscribed for a $2.5 billion IPO. We haven't seen that in 5 to 10 years. There's some derivative items to consider. With the Zoetis IPO, there's now a newfound interest in animal health care. The great thing about animal health is there's no managed care, there's no intermediaries, you don't have to worry about the FDA. Clinical trials stop at the animal versus start at the animal. This is a really good business. Investors are looking for new ideas to invest in animal health. So any of you with drug delivery companies, that might be an area to look at. I remember Alza years ago had an implantable device for ivermectin, which was an anti-parasitic product used in cattle. Again, people talk about emerging markets, but this is now big business. Sanofi has 1/3 of their business in emerging markets, and it's growing. So for companies with drug delivery with drug delivery technology, it may make sense to start talking to a lot of the Latin American companies, Russian companies, et cetera, et cetera. Biogenerics, biosimilars. People have been talking about these for a long time. There's still no pathway at the FDA. Momenta, a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, has been successful recently. An acid test will be this fall when the Teva launches a biosimilar to Amgen's Neupogen. But drug delivery makes sense in biogenerics, biosimilars, and that is a high-risk but high-reward area to focus on. And finally, there are a lot of shortages out there. There'll continue to be shortages. So perhaps you may have an idea to develop a drug where there's a high shortage, and obviously the pricing in this area will be very good. Now let's get down to stocks. So I'd like to offer my stock picks for 2013. We divide it into large cap stocks and small cap stocks. A small cap stock is basically $1 billion market value or less. Now you'd be surprised, you would think most analysts would get over 50% of their stock picks right, but I know many who are employed whose track record is well south of that. So what I tell investors is, if I can do better than Shaquille O'Neal can shoot free throws, and by the way, for those of you who don't know him, Shaquille O'Neal is a famous basketball player. He's going to the Hall of Fame. The only thing he really couldn't do is shoot free throws. His free throw percentage is about 55 to 60%. So if I can pick stocks better than Shaquille O'Neal, that's good. So let's go back and look at my presentation 2 years ago. Here are my 3 favorite stocks. Valeant, leader in dermatology, and a company that makes an acquisition every month, and a leader in emerging markets. Shire Pharmaceuticals, I mentioned before, a leader in ADHD and biologics. And MAP Pharmaceuticals was the company I discussed previously, working on a new improved version, a new drug for migraine. So, actually, I did better than Shaquille O'Neal. I got 2 out of 3 that did pretty well. Valeant was up 65%, Shire was up 54%. Unfortunately, MAP had some issues with some delays. Their stock was down 21%, but overall, not bad. So, what are my favorite stocks for 2013? Allergan was actually on here before I knew Sisha was going to be presenting. Allergan, as you heard this morning, has Botox, which is a fantastic franchise. It keeps growing. It's never going to go generic. But the reason I like Allergan is they have two data sets coming out this year, one for DARPin, for back of the eye disease, and one for male pattern baldness. I don't know if you know about Latisse. My wife uses it. It helps grow your eyelashes, and it's now being tested in males. And I think there's a good chance both of these will have successful outcomes. If they do, Allergan stock could be up 30 to 40% for the year. It's already up 15% in the first month of the year. Shire has a lot of interesting clinical readouts, new orphan drugs for Sanfilippo's disease, for Hunter's disease, and I think that could be a good stock as well. And in the small cap arena, luckily I picked MAP because 4 weeks later it was taken over and it's up 60%. And the other one that I think will do is Cadence. I think it's undervalued, and I think they now have critical mass with their pain products. So those are my 4 ideas for 2013. Beware, however, a lot of these have already done pretty well, so my enthusiasm is now a little bit tempered. So, to wrap up, before I take your questions, if there are any, just a couple thoughts. First, it's nice to see improving trends in pharmaceuticals. It's nice to see improving trends on Wall Street. We're not out of the woods yet. There's certainly a lot of challenges. Today, for example, the stock market was down over 100 points because the Draghi, who's the central banker in Italy, talked about more bad news in Europe, so you never know. But we're not out of the woods, but things are certainly getting better. And for your industry, for drug delivery, many of the companies have adapted and adapted well. So for those companies, those drug delivery companies that have tweaked their business model a little bit, those drug delivery companies have focused on areas that have previously been successful, like pain management. For those drug delivery companies that have quickly responded to changes in the regulatory environment, reimbursement environment, vacuums created by all the companies being acquired. And finally, as always, for those drug delivery companies that have the right technology, utilizing the right product, these are the companies who've adapted, and I think on average, these types of companies will do very well in the future. So those are my remarks, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
The healthcare reform has become clearer.
Yes.
So that's provided some clarity, but there is still the question of the fiscal crisis, and how is that going to impact the private sector, especially with the healthcare companies?
So you're basically talking about states that basically have no money, yet have to pay for people's drugs. Well, we're the last country in the world where the government is not the major purchaser of drugs, and I think, frankly, at least in my viewpoint, that's got to change over the next 10 years. We can't fight a war and pay for everyone's medicine and have the deficit the way we do. So I think inevitably the government's going to become the major purchaser of drugs, and that will not be good for most companies, except those who have the most novel, unique products or targeting a disease that no one else has. So I'm pretty negative on the outlook for U.S. pharma, European pharma. It's a mature, fragmented industry. Most of the major therapeutic classes, lipid-lowering agents, depression, hypertension, they've all been commoditized. So what we really need are some new breakthroughs, Alzheimer's, et cetera, et cetera. But other than that, the average drug company in the United States and Europe in the next 10 years is probably not the best place to be.
Hi. You mentioned that you're seeing some better launch performance recently versus, I guess, in a few years prior. Anecdotally, I hear a lot of improved formulations struggling with reimbursement. And how are those two? Are companies doing a better job justifying the value propositions, or why are the launches getting better?
Well, 5 years ago, 9 out of 10 20 years ago, every launch did well. In the last 5 or 10 years, I'd say 8 out of 10 haven't done well. Now, part of that is just relative to expectations. Analysts used to get very excited about every launch, particularly biotech analysts, like every drug was going to be $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion. So part of this is just reduce expectations. But the companies seem to have done a better job with managed care ahead of time, and some of the drugs are value add, like Pacira's new pain drug has had a really strong launch. Forest has a new drug in the COPD area, which has had a really strong launch. So it may be that there are indications where there's significant unmet needs, as in these two cases a little bit, but also companies have been doing a better job with managed care. And the other thing is there's some tricks, about these copay cards. So if you're tier 3 and the script is $60, you may only pay $20 because the company pays the $40 in the form of a rebate, and so it looks like a cheaper script. Pharmaceutical companies hate that, but that's the reality now, and that's also helping the launches.
Thank you very much again for that.
Okay, thank you.